There's a moment in your life that you do not remember, but it defined everything about you. You don't remember it because your mind, as it was forming, was open, too open, and everything slipped in like smoke into an empty house. The truth is unsettling. Before you had conscious defenses, before you could question, before you could protect yourself, you absorbed everything: your mother's moods, your father's tone, the subtle flickers of approval or rejection, the invisible rules of a household, the fears that lived in your family's walls, the insecurities, the power dynamics, the language of shame and reward. All of it. It happened silently, not as choices, but as programming. And by the time you were 7, the machine was running perfectly. Your beliefs about love, success, failure, money, your body, your worth, all installed. Without your permission, you walk around today with those programs running still. And that's what's most haunting. You think your desires are your own? You think your anxieties came from experience? You think your personality is authentic? But what if they aren't? What if your entire life is simply running a script written in those first few fragile years? This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry. This is exactly how the human mind works. For the first 7 years of your life, your mind operated in a state that neuroscientists describe as a hypnotic trance. In this trance, you accepted everything around you as truth, not suggestion. There was no filter. There was no ability to say, "No, that's not me." There was no critical thinking at all. Every word your parents spoke became part of your worldview. Every scowl, every praise, every frustration you witnessed etched into the blueprint of your subconscious. And here's the catch. You cannot remember any of this consciously because the very self that could judge these things had not yet formed. So your patterns today, your anxieties, your insecurities, your tendencies to sabotage yourself, are the ghosts of those 7 years. The ghosts run the show now, and they're invisible. The terrifying truth is that when you say, "This is who I am," what you really mean is, "This is who I was programmed to be." During those early years, your brain operated primarily in the theta frequency range, the brainwave state associated with hypnosis, deep learning, and heightened suggestibility. This was nature's way of downloading culture, family dynamics, survival strategies, without question, so that by the time you reached adulthood, you could function in your environment. Except this environment was flawed, and so your programming was flawed. You inherited trauma without realizing it. You learned false ideas of what is possible and impossible. You adopted shame and fear that didn't belong to you, and even today, your deepest behaviors, the way you respond to criticism, the way you self-soothe, the way you seek love, the way you spend money, are almost entirely unconscious echoes of that original programming. This is why change is so difficult. This is why self-improvement often fails. You're not fighting your habits. You're fighting a deeply installed script you didn't write. But there's something more haunting. This programming is not random. It follows a precise biological map. There is an architecture inside you. An architecture most people never learn about. A map of imprint vulnerability embedded into your very evolution. And once you understand this architecture, you begin to see your entire life has followed its stages. Automatically, predictably. That's where we turn next. This is where Prometheus Rising gives us a map that feels almost occult in its precision, the 8 circuits of consciousness, but we begin with the most ancient. The first circuit, the biosurvival circuit. In your earliest days, infancy, your whole mind was devoted to one simple question. Am I safe? You weren't reasoning. You couldn't compare options. You simply absorbed impressions from your environment. Did the arms that held you feel secure? Was food reliably provided? Were your caregivers calm or anxious? In this stage, every sensation your infant body experienced created your foundational imprint of security or insecurity, your baseline setting for trust. If your environment was stable, nurturing, consistent, you developed a secure imprint. If it was chaotic, inconsistent, frightening, you developed an insecure imprint. And this imprint didn't just shape your attitude about your parents, it became your core programming for reality itself. If you were imprinted for insecurity, you will expect betrayal in relationships. You will feel anxiety when things seem too good. You will unconsciously sabotage stability because your core programming says, the world is unpredictable, I must be alert. If you were imprinted for safety, you will walk through life with an ease you can't explain. You will trust others quickly, believe in abundance, feel worthy of support. And here's what's haunting. You don't remember this imprint, but it defines every relationship you have. The second circuit, the emotional territorial circuit. By the time you were a toddler, something new emerged, not just survival, but status. You began to feel out your power, your boundaries, your position. This is where ideas like dominance, submission, hierarchy, and competition were imprinted. How did your caregivers discipline you? Did they allow you to assert yourself? Were they authoritarian? Were they permissive? Every interaction became part of your emotional territorial programming. And this circuit runs today when you get nervous around authority figures, feel the need to dominate conversations, shrink in the presence of confidence, feel comfortable or uncomfortable asserting your needs. Again, you didn't choose this programming. You absorbed it. Your nervous system learned what territory meant, how to act in hierarchies, before you even had language. The third circuit, the symbolic or semantic circuit. Around the age of 4, you began developing language, logic, symbols. Now your brain wasn't just absorbing impressions, it was categorizing them, labeling them, narrating them. Your parents' words became your inner monologue. Their judgments became your thought patterns. Their praise defined what you associated with good. Their criticism defined what you associated with bad. This is the circuit where belief systems are installed. If you grew up in a religious household, you absorbed its stories not as stories, but as unquestionable realities. If your parents emphasized success, money, achievement, you began narrating your life in those terms. If your environment emphasized shame, guilt, punishment, those became the internal symbols that structured your view of yourself. And today, your mind still operates according to those categories. Even your rationality is not really rational. It's a program of words, phrases, stories, judgments, and taboos that you inherited before you had the capacity to challenge them. So by age 7, you had been programmed by 3 evolutionary circuits, each layered on top of the other. Safety versus insecurity, biosurvival imprint. Dominance versus submission, emotional territorial imprint. Logic, language, belief systems, symbolic imprint. These circuits are still running today. They dictate how you feel when you walk into a room. They determine whether you instinctively trust or fear others. They define your automatic reactions to authority, love, money, ambition. And here's the eerie part. You call these reactions you. But they're not you. They're a series of biological programs installed at precise windows of imprint vulnerability, when you had no choice but to absorb them. That's why when you try to change yourself today, when you try to build confidence or stop self-sabotage, you're fighting ghosts. You're trying to overwrite ancient circuits that were installed when you were too small to speak. This is why Robert Anton Wilson, author of Prometheus Rising, calls the human being a biocomputer. You are programmable. And you were programmed. By the time you turned 7, these 3 circuits had already crystallized into the invisible architecture of your life. But what makes this truly eerie is that these early circuits aren't isolated. They form the foundation upon which every later experience must be interpreted. Your core programming was now set. The 4th circuit, the social sexual circuit. In Prometheus Rising, Wilson explains that beginning around age 7 and intensifying in adolescence, you enter the domain of the social sexual circuit. This is where cultural norms are grafted onto your biology. This is where your identity, not just as an individual, but as a member of a collective, takes form. But remember, the first 3 circuits dictate how this one develops. If you were programmed for insecurity, subordination, shame, your emergence into the social sexual circuit will reflect that you will feel uncomfortable in your body, you may fear intimacy, you may feel confused about your identity. If your earlier programming installed confidence, ease, and healthy boundaries, you will express yourself fluidly, comfortably adopting social roles. This is why we often feel like we are stuck, replaying patterns in relationships and social life. Because we are. You're running on early programs you can't even recall. This fourth circuit explains so many of our adult frustrations. Why you feel social anxiety without knowing why. Why intimacy feels risky or frightening. Why approval from the collective feels addictively important, even when you know you should be independent. You weren't born craving approval. You weren't born ashamed of your body. You weren't born afraid of rejection. These were all programmed responses, conditioned into you after your early circuits created a fertile soil for them to take root. Let's go even deeper. Why are these first 7 years so critical? Why is the mind of a child so absorbent, so defenseless? It's biological. Wilson draws heavily from ethology, the study of animal behavior, to explain this phenomenon. In animals, imprinting is clear and abrupt. A duckling, for example, will bond with the first moving object it sees upon hatching, even if that object is not its mother. That imprint sets its entire orientation to reality. Humans have a more complex brain, but the principle is the same. Each evolutionary circuit activates at a particular developmental stage when the nervous system is primed for a certain kind of learning. In infancy, the nervous system is primed for biosurvival imprinting, bonding, and security. In toddlerhood, it is primed for emotional territorial imprinting, hierarchy, and dominance. In early childhood, it is primed for symbolic imprinting, language, belief, culture, and these imprint windows close. Once the imprint window closes, the pattern is fixed, and later experiences are simply wired onto this initial scaffold. That means later therapy, education, and experience rarely penetrate the raw programming itself. They can modify it, rationalize it, obscure it, but they cannot truly erase it. That's why it often feels like your life runs on autopilot, because at a very deep level, it does. By now, you may sense the dark implication. You imagine yourself as an agent of free will, moving through life making independent choices. But if your basic emotional tone, trust or fear, was determined before you could think, if your attitude toward hierarchy was absorbed before you could reason, if your fundamental belief structures were absorbed before you even knew what a belief was, then most of your so-called choices are simply executions of early programming. You were conditioned by voices you can no longer hear. You were shaped by moods and environments you can no longer see. You were programmed to react to life in ways you believe are natural, but are actually inherited patterns from people who themselves were programmed. It is a recursive loop, a generational trance. This is what makes Prometheus Rising so radical. It doesn't just describe a society, and now it describes the human condition itself as a programmable system. And that system was programmed, largely irrevocably, by the time you turned 7. Why is this so difficult to see? Because the program disguises itself as reality. When you walk into a room and feel a twinge of anxiety, you assume that's because this situation is stressful. When you feel a desperate need for approval, you assume that's because people matter. When you shrink from conflict, you assume that's because conflict is bad. But none of these are objective facts. They are conditioned interpretations you cannot distinguish from direct perception. You live inside a reality tunnel, a tunnel built by the first 7 years of your life. And yet, there is a paradox here. Even though these imprints are nearly irreversible, there is a path out. But it's not easy. You must first become aware of your programming. Aware that your emotions are not objective responses but triggered patterns. Aware that your beliefs are not inherent truths but inherited maps. Aware that your very sense of self is an artifact of conditioning. That awareness is the first spark of liberation. It is the beginning of waking up. The fifth circuit, the neurosomatic circuit. Wilson argues that most people remain trapped in their first 4 circuits. They remain programmed, reactive, predictable. But Prometheus Rising suggests that a kind of escape hatch exists, a way to transcend this early conditioning. This begins with the 5th circuit, The neurosomatic circuit. The neurosomatic circuit is body consciousness liberated from fear, whereas the earlier circuits interpret the body as a survival machine or a social display device. The fifth circuit is where the body becomes a source of blissful feedback, a playground of direct sensation unmediated by belief or conditioning. In simple terms, the fifth circuit allows you to feel alive, not through stories, validation, or achievements, but through direct experience. But the catch is this: most people never activate this circuit because their earlier programming prevents them from even accessing it. You see this everywhere. People carry bodies full of tension, stress, shame. They experience their own embodiment as problematic or burdensome. They are disconnected from sensation itself, from the joy of breath, the rhythm of movement, the sheer aesthetic pleasure of being alive. Why? Because their first 7 years installed programs that taught them that embodiment itself is risky, dirty, unsafe, or shameful. This is why waking up requires dissolving old programs first, or at least realizing they exist. The sixth circuit, metaprogramming. This brings us to the next evolutionary leap, the metaprogramming circuit. This circuit is where the real potential lies. Wilson describes this as the capacity to recognize that you are programmed and to begin rewriting your own software. But here's the haunting paradox. Until you realize your programming, you will think your programming is you. The metaprogramming circuit allows you to experience your beliefs, habits, fears, and desires not as yourself, but as programmable scripts running on the hardware of your nervous system. Most people will never achieve this. The reason? Because their programs contain instructions not to question the program itself. This is the invisible prison. You were programmed before you had language, and the program itself installed a firewall. Never look behind the curtain. That's why this kind of awakening often feels terrifying, because it means losing not just a few bad habits, but losing your entire inherited identity. When you step back far enough, when the metaprogramming circuit activates, you see that the self you defend, the identity you protect, is not something you chose. It's something that was installed. You didn't pick your name. You didn't pick your language. You didn't pick your beliefs about good and evil. You didn't pick your fundamental style of attachment, trust, fear, love, anger. It was all installed by parents, culture, media, religion, accidents of history, before you were capable of choice. And so when you cling to who you are actually clinging to an artifact of programming. This is not pessimism. This is liberation. Because the moment you recognize that this self is a program, you can begin to rewrite it. But without that recognition, you remain trapped. A puppet whose strings are invisible because they were attached before you could see. The seventh circuit, neurogenetic consciousness. In Prometheus Rising, Wilson goes further still. Once you transcend even the metaprogramming circuit, there is another, the neurogenetic circuit. This is where you become aware of yourself not just as an individual, but as the current manifestation of an ancient genetic line. You begin to experience the collective memory embedded in your DNA. At this level, your programming is seen not just as personal, but as ancestral. You carry inherited patterns from generations before you. You embody the struggles, fears, and dreams of your ancestors. And if you awaken to this, you can liberate yourself not just from childhood conditioning, but from ancient conditioning. This is why awakening is often experienced as both terrifying and sacred. It means realizing that your nervous system carries programs older than history itself. Here's the truth Wilson hints at. The vast majority of humans will never experience circuits 5, 6, or 7. They will live their entire lives trapped in the first 4 circuits. They will seek survival in a world of imagined threats, compete for dominance and submission in endless power games, cling to symbols and beliefs that were installed in childhood, struggle for status, approval, and identity in social structures they never chose. And they will believe this is reality itself. They will defend their prison, because they have been programmed to. This is why your early programming is so powerful. It doesn't just shape what you think, it shapes your ability to think at all. The eighth circuit, the quantum circuit. In the final stage of consciousness described in Prometheus Rising, Robert Anton Wilson takes us into territory most people consider mystical, absurd, or impossible. This is the quantum circuit. Here, the individual no longer experiences themselves as a fixed identity moving through a solid, deterministic world. Instead, they begin to sense reality as a fluid, probabilistic, ever-shifting field. What does this mean? It means you realize reality is not one fixed thing. Your perception helps collapse possibilities into actuality. You are not just a product of your programming. You are a participant in the unfolding dance of reality itself. At this level, you experience life less as an actor bound by a script and more as a co-author, surfing waves of potential. But, and this is crucial, you cannot access this circuit until you have done the work of awakening from the earlier programs. Why? Because if you carry the survival fears of the first circuit, the power games of the second, the belief rigidity of the third, or the social anxieties of the fourth, then any glimpse of quantum consciousness will only be co-opted by those scripts. It will become more ego, more fantasy, more delusion. You cannot skip the latter. So where does this leave you? With an unsettling, but ultimately empowering realization. You were programmed, but you can become the programmer. Not perfectly, not absolutely, but enough. Enough to recognize that your mind is not a fixed object, but a living, evolving system. Enough to see that your anxiety is not you, it's a pattern. Your anger is not you, it's a script. Your beliefs are not truth, they're cultural artifacts. Your identity is not real, it's a costume. And once you see this, you can begin to play. You can begin to rewrite. Let's not romanticize this. The path to awakening is not a straight line, and it's not a checklist, it's not a weekend workshop. It is brutal, because it requires dying, over and over. To parts of yourself you thought were essential, you will have to face the pain of early wounds. You will have to question the symbols you worship. You will have to walk away from inherited roles, from inherited loyalties, from inherited fears. You will have to confront the terrifying realization that I am not who I thought I was. And then, in that space of groundlessness, you will discover something strange, beautiful, and unspeakably liberating. You are not the program. You are the awareness in which the program runs. Why does this matter? Because if you do not awaken to your programming, you will live and die as a puppet, calling it free will. You will defend inherited traumas as just my nature. You will fight battles that were installed in you before you could speak. You will chase desires you never chose. You will avoid fears that were never yours. And you will die believing you were an individual when you were simply an obedient machine. But if you awaken, if you dare to look behind the curtain, you become something more: a participant, a metaprogrammer, a co-creator. You move from the realm of mechanical cause and effect to the shimmering edge of possibility. Wilson calls this the great cosmic joke, that the human being, a programmable, reflexive, mechanical system, can, at a certain point, turn and see itself, and in that moment of seeing, become something new. Not just a product, not just a puppet, but a player. And here's the final, most beautiful twist. The script that was written in your first 7 years, it's not the end of the story, it's just the beginning. And so we arrive here, you, sitting alone, watching this video, carrying with you the ghosts of 7 silent years, the programming complete, the architecture built, the scripts running quietly in the background. The haunting truth is this: before you could speak, you were coded. Before you could choose, you were conditioned. Before you could think, you were trained to think a certain way. And now, here you are, decades later, believing this is you. But now, you know better. You have seen the map. You've seen that the you who hesitates, who fears, who seeks approval, who self-sabotages, is not the real you. It is a program, written early, written silently, written by others who themselves were programmed. The first 7 years are not just childhood. They are the creation of your reality tunnel, the lens through which every experience is filtered, categorized, judged. You thought you were free. You thought you were independent. You thought your choices were yours. Number. They were shaped by caregivers who didn't know what they were doing, by cultures that didn't question their own madness, by symbols you couldn't understand, by moods, by tensions, by rewards and punishments you could not interpret. And all the while, the circuits clicked into place. The bio-survival circuit, the emotional territorial circuit, the symbolic circuit, the social sexual circuit, layer after layer, until by age 7, you were fully programmed, walking, talking, thinking, feeling according to the scripts you received. But here's the miracle. The very fact that you can hear these words, the very fact that you can even imagine that your life has been programmed, means that you are capable of seeing it. And what you can see, you can change. Not by fighting the program, not by hating it, not by blaming your parents or your culture or your childhood, but by seeing it clearly and refusing to identify with it any longer. You are not the frightened child you once were. You are not the insecure toddler you once were. You are not the confused symbol processing child you once were. You are the awareness that survived it all. And this awareness, this silent, observing presence, is not programmed. It is free. It always has been. The first 7 years programmed your entire life, but that was only the default mode. It was the first script. You can write new scripts. You can deprogram the reflexes of fear, submission, shame. You can step out of the tunnel and look back at it from above. You can laugh at the ghosts who tried to make you who they thought you should be. You can laugh at the absurdity of it all. And in that laughter, that great cosmic joke Robert Anton Wilson spoke of, you become something more than programmed. You become something that is awake. So the next time you find yourself reacting automatically, hesitating when you want to act, shrinking when you want to stand tall, pleasing when you want to speak truth, remember this moment. Remember this truth. Remember that hesitation is not you. That shrinking is not you. That obedience is not you. It is a program. And you are the space in which that program runs. You are free. But freedom comes at a cost. The cost of awareness. The cost of courage. The cost of walking away from everything you were taught to believe. Are you willing? That is the question Prometheus Rising poses. But in a language deeper than words. In a language your soul recognizes but your mind cannot fully grasp. Before you go to sleep tonight, pause for just a moment and listen carefully. Because behind your thoughts, behind your feelings, behind your habits and reflexes and identities, there is a silence. And in that silence is the only thing that was never programmed. You.